Well, welcome back everyone to these YouTube videos. I hope you're continuing to find them helpful. If you're still watching the series, then I presume that you are. I'm doing a whole bunch of these all at once, and I'm just trying to break it up into multiple videos just to make it more accessible for folks. But if you've got any kind of, and I'll be uploading these, I guess, over the next couple days, whatever, try to spread it out a little bit. But if you've got any suggestions for improvements that we could make to the format, go for it. And as always, if you've got any questions that maybe you've always had, or maybe something that came up based on something I said, and you're like, wait a minute, Father Dan, but what about this? Or you weren't very clear about that, Father Dan. You really muddled that one up. If you need any kind of clarification, then by all means, get in touch with us. Comment below in the YouTube video, and or send some info into our office. So some heavy hitting ones. I was originally gonna organize this list as it came in, and maybe Sue touched it up a little bit. She was collecting these as they were coming in, but I didn't really need to. They were already kind of in an order that made a lot of sense to me. So, what happens to non-Christians when they die? Do they go to heaven? What happens when a person dies that never had a religion? And if someone was never baptized, do they get to heaven? So, really interesting stuff. I remember getting so into this in high school and so fascinated by this. And even since then, the church has come to some new insights and understandings about how this might work. So, baptism is necessary for salvation. Because Christ is necessary for salvation, okay? Christ came to save us from our sins. So this is the first and sort of basic understanding, the first starting point. So sometimes people would say, well, I'm sure it's going to work out for everybody. Well, it doesn't really matter what I do. I'm sure God loves me. And God does love you. But if you're hurting people, God loves them too. So there's always this challenge to stop sinning, to stop harming others, to stop harming God's creation. And if you keep harming them, sooner or later that's going to catch up with you. And sometimes, very rarely, that happens in a miraculous way. Otherwise, much more commonly, our behavior has its own way of blowing up, and we know the consequences of our actions. But baptism is necessary for salvation. So that's the starting point. But then you'd say, but Father Dan, I can think of a whole bunch of exceptions to that rule, okay? Or situations, I guess I should say, that would fall outside of that. So you're out, like, this person really went through situations that are very good here. So what happens to non-Christians when they die? So Jewish people would be the classic one. I believe it's Romans 11. Paul talks about the covenant. It's like, is it Romans 9 and 11 or Romans 11 or Romans 7 and 9? But my teacher in seminary would put those passages together, if I remember Marion's class correctly, and it talks about Paul and the covenants and the teaching that the covenants that Jesus that God entered into them in the Old Testament. He made a series of promises to them, and while he did promise that he would send them a savior, he would honor those old covenants. So the history of Christian and Jewish relations has some incredibly dark moments. And people have used and abused the Bible in various ways to attack the Jewish people, sometimes even blaming people in much, much later ages for the death of Jesus Christ. That's unacceptable. We cannot do that. And in fact, as Catholics, we acknowledge that they have a deal with God that was around long before we knew about Jesus. And so you can still do it the old way. It's just a lot of work, right? You don't have any of the sacraments, the graces and helps that Jesus brings. So it's taken us a while to to work this out, and kind of like estranged siblings who had a big fight, and now we're gradually trying to mend and learn from each other and try to see things from the other person's point of view. I know I have found Jewish insights about the Bible to always be so helpful. They have a much better understanding of the Old Testament than Christians do, for the most part. So I'm sure you can find Christians that are amazing at the Old Testament and Jewish people that are horrible at it. There's always exceptions, right? So what happens to non-Christians when they die? Do they go to heaven? And so we sort of cover a couple of other categories with this. What happens if a person dies that never had a religion at all? And no belief in God whatsoever. And if someone was never baptized, did they get to heaven? So what I wanted to do was turn to... There we go. The good old Catechism of the Catholic Church, which continues to have this awful parchment background that is just from the 90s and looks awful. So I apologize for that. I can't fix it for you. I can make it fit on the screen, though. So the Catechism of the Catholic Church is, as I've talked about in the past, it's like a big old, like an encyclopedia, but shorter, kind of like Wikipedia, but it's not something that everybody edits. It's an official document of the Church, but it's meant to be a really concise summary of our teachings. And even as a really concise summary of our teachings, it's still a book that's like this thick. And it goes through different things about the sacraments, about the creed, about prayer, about worship, and all kinds of different things. And this section here, starting in paragraph 1257, if you're following along at home, okay? Is the necessity of baptism. And you can see they actually got this little outline up here on the top of it that it's under the celebration of the Christian mystery sacrament section, the sacrament of baptism. And the Lord himself affirms that baptism is necessary for salvation. They have these lovely little footnotes. You just click on it, 59, it says, oh, it's in John 3, okay? He also commands his disciples, and this is, you could just search for Catechism of the Catholic Church if you want to try to find this. It's on Vatican.va. You're not going to see a lot of .vas out there. It's usually .com, right? VA is for Vatican City. And so he also commands his disciples to proclaim the gospel to all nations, to baptize them. So he says it's necessary, and you got to start spreading it around. It's necessary for salvation for those to whom the gospel has been proclaimed and who have the possibility of asking for this sacrament. So the church is already starting to have in mind, like, wait a minute, Jesus dies on the cross, and it's like, what, John's there and his mother? How many other people knew about that? What about the Aztecs? They're over here. Actually, I don't even know if the Aztecs were around at that point yet. But you've got all of these other groups around the world that there is no way that they had any idea about Jesus dying over there in the Holy Land. They can't ask for baptism. Even if they could ask for baptism, nobody's around to baptize them. Nobody is there to preach the gospel. So it's this amazing opportunity of grace and salvation that the disciples are desperately trying to spread as fast as they can, but it's not exactly fair that these people are dying all the time and they're not being saved. So the first and easiest group, we talk about the Limbo of the fathers, those that died even before Jesus was born. Abraham, Isaac, David, people that are, of great importance in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And, we'd say they're great heroes, and they're probably in heaven. Abraham specifically, you have Jesus talking about in the story of Lazarus, right? Lazarus is up there clearly in heaven on the bosom of Abraham, right? So Jesus is saying Abraham's in heaven, but Jesus hasn't died yet. So what's going on? So there has to be some way to get to heaven for Abraham. And the theory of Limbo of the Fathers would say that from the point of view of Abraham, he died and he went to a sort of like a waiting room, like a waiting place. Says, oh, heaven's not open yet. You can't come inside. Nobody's making him particularly miserable. He's not in hell, but he's waiting. And then Jesus, when it says that Jesus, in our creed, when Jesus suffered, died, rose again. He descended into hell and rose again on the third day. When he descended into hell, the image there is that he was visiting the abode of the dead, those that had gone before, and he went to sort of like evangelize them in a sense, to set them free. And those who would have recognized in him the presence of the God whom they worshipped in their lives would have been set free as well, and they would have entered gladly into heaven. So Jesus says to Dismas, that thief, today you will be with me in paradise. Dismas dies shortly after Jesus does, and then Jesus goes and he gets Abraham, and he gets David, and he gets everybody else, and brings them up to heaven. Okay, so that's sort of the image that's going on there. That's one group of people that was not baptized during their ordinary life down here, but they loved God very much, and we absolutely know that they're in heaven. But what about the Aztecs? What about those people that never would have known God as we know God? So the church does not know of any means other than baptism that assures entry into beatitude. So we're going to get a little speculative here, okay? We don't know. This is why I take care not to neglect the mission. So if we were to find some way to say, like, maybe the Aztecs can make it without baptism, we want to be really careful that doesn't undercut the urgency of missionary work. Because it's really tough sometimes. I don't want to go over there and get dysentery. I don't want to go over there and get tomahawked. Okay? So, you know what? Maybe God will sort them out. Might be the temptation, right? They're probably going to be fine. Let them do their thing. No, we know that God wanted us to spread this, that Jesus wanted us to spread the good news, to evangelize. Christianity is an evangelizing faith. So the church has always held the firm conviction that those who suffer death for the sake of the faith without having received baptism by their death are baptized by their death for and with Christ. This is called a baptism of blood. Okay? So, for a variety of reasons in the days in the early church, they would delay being baptized sometimes. Okay, they didn't really have worked out an understanding of what confession was. So, if you wanted to get your sins forgiven, you'd get baptized, but you can only get baptized once, which means you can only get your sins forgiven once. Which means if you thought that there was any chance that you were going to sin before you died, you might want to wait to get baptized until after that. So it's sort of this weird culture where you're just always waiting for the last possible minute to get baptized, and I'm so glad we have confession now. Anyway, but if somebody's like going through the process even maybe they want to be baptized as soon as they can, but they're still taking classes, they're still in the RCIA or something like that, right? But they get killed before they can get there. The church is just so sure. It's like they wanted this so badly. How could God say, I don't see any baptism on you, you can't come in here. This person literally died for their faith. It is the highest witness. It is the best following of Christ that you can have. Surely if anybody's going to heaven, they are. So we'd say, well, if baptism is necessary, we're going to call this baptism. That's a baptism right there. It's not a baptism of water. It's a baptism of blood. Just like blood and water flowed from Jesus' side on the cross, if you wanted to be more poetic about it. So it's not a sacrament, but it's still baptism. Catechumens who died before their baptism. Okay? So this is another category of people. They believe in God. They're eagerly looking for the faith. But, maybe they die in a car crash. So not necessarily martyrdom, but they still would have received baptism if they had the opportunity to. So we're going to say God would step in there and say, come on in. I know well your heart and what you would have wanted. Come on in. Remember that baptism is ultimately a gift from God in the first place. God dwells in heaven. He does what he wills. So when we're looking at this, we're basing it on what he has told us in the scriptures, but we're also kind of trying to reconcile different things we see him doing in the scriptures. So they're supposed to receive it together with repentance for sins, assures them of salvation that they were not able to receive through the sacraments. Okay? Now we have so again they're in a very organized way. They're working through categories of people. We're getting like some of the easy cases first, and then farther and farther away. So 1260 here. Since Christ died for all, and since all men are in fact called to one and the same destiny, which is divine, so we're all called to be with God. We're all called to heaven. Not everybody answers that call. Not everybody wants to go. We must hold that the Holy Spirit offers to all the possibility of being made partakers in a way known to God of the Paschal mystery. So this is sort of a weird one. It's to say that we're all supposed to be in heaven. God isn't up there, Jesus dies on the cross and God's over in South America saying, oh, look, more babies. They're all going to go to hell. Cool. All right, let's just keep making babies over there. That would be a really weird... That would be a really weird thing to do. So they're all called to be with him. There's some way for them to not be in hell, but it's not baptism, because they can't get baptized by water or by blood. So every man who's ignorant of the gospel of Christ and of his church, but seeks the truth and does the will of God in accordance with his understanding of it, can be saved. It may be supposed that such persons would have desired baptism explicitly if they had known its necessity. So we talked about baptism of water, baptism of blood. This is sometimes called baptism of desire. Think of somebody over in that culture that like, oh my goodness, they're so wonderful. They love everybody. They care for everybody. They take care of the poor. You're just in awe. And you think, like, this person is great. So, missionaries will often look for great heroes, maybe people that have died in that culture, and say, yes, look at this person. This is what we need more of. This is the kind of thing that Christianity holds dear. It's not necessarily walking into this place and saying, oh my gosh, you're all awful, and everything you've ever done is awful. Okay? You're looking for the good, and you're trying to build on that as a missionary. So we talk about a baptism of water, a baptism of blood, and a baptism of desire. Well, they would have wanted to be baptized if they had the opportunity, like Abraham or David. Then we talk about children. As regards children who have died without baptism, the church can only entrust them to the mercy of God as she does in her funeral rites for them. Indeed, the great mercy of God, who desires that all should be saved, and Jesus' tenderness toward children, which causes us to say that children whom we do not hinder them, allow us to hope that there is a way to salvation for children who died without baptism. All the more urgent is the church's call not to prevent little children coming to Christ through the gift of holy baptism. So this is one reason why the church practices infant baptism. We don't want to wait. You don't want a child to die of illness or in a horrible car crash and not be baptized, because we're going to trust them to the mercy of God, but we also understand that God told us it's very important to have people baptized. So we don't want to take any chances. Baptize them as soon as we can, and and we're just trying to do the best that we can from what God has told us. Quick note on that: some theologians had this speculation about a place called Limbo. Limbo is sort of like an in-between state. So earlier I was talking about sort of this place where the fathers might be waiting in between heaven and earth, and this is sort of like a similar idea. But they're not waiting. It just goes on forever. And it was this gray box that theologians could kind of like put babies, because they'd say like, well, they weren't baptized, so they can't go to heaven, but they don't deserve to go to hell. So I don't know. They probably go somewhere else. Well, the Bible doesn't say anything about that. The Bible doesn't say that there's like another third place. Sometimes they would describe limbo as a place of perfect natural happiness. Whatever that means. They're happy, like the happiest people on earth, but they're not close to God somehow. It was difficult to imagine, and it was a bit fanciful. It was human beings trying to fill in a gap and trying to reconcile different passages of the Bible. It said that baptism is necessary and that God loves little children and wants them to come to him. So Limbo was dropped. There's a document about that. Which is over in this tab. International Theological Commission, the hope of salvation for infants who die without being baptized. Again, as you can tell by this awful parchment paper, this is still on Vatican.va. And it refers to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which I was just reading, and it says the theory of limbo is not mentioned, entrusted to the mercy of God. And so the conclusion of this basically is that We don't hold with limbo anymore. We're not going to talk about limbo anymore. The only reason Father Dan is even bringing up limbo is because somebody may have mentioned it to you in the past, and I don't want people passing this around. It's not a thing. It's not a Bible thing. It's a fanciful theory that some theologians came up with that was helpful for a little while, but is not helpful anymore. So I have hope in the mercy of God that infants would go to heaven. So lastly, and I don't think this came up in the question, but there's another group of people. If someone was never baptized, do they get to heaven? What about the person who's in New York City in 2021 and knows all about Jesus and hates the guy? I can imagine a way that even such a person could possibly still get to heaven, because they may not be hating Jesus so much as hating who they think Jesus is. Okay? So if every experience of Christians you've ever had has been awful and toxic, you may think, I want nothing to do with that. So in a weird way, you're still pursuing goodness, and therefore ultimately you're still pursuing God, but you're rejecting his church. Okay? So maybe that works out for such a person. Remember Jesus talking about the millstone tied around the neck. Better a millstone tied around the neck than someone that causes someone to sin. So I think anybody that has scandalized such a person or driven them away from benefiting from the sacraments, they're going to have some explaining to do when they get to heaven. I would not want to be in their shoes. Okay, they're going to be in a lot more trouble than the person who was trying to do the right thing and was not finding it in the church. Remember how tough Jesus is on the Pharisees for causing similar problems. So even such a person, I would say, well, what are they really looking for? So I think that's would fall a little bit more under baptism of desire. If they really knew who Jesus was, if they really knew who was offering them water, then they would ask. Okay. It is said that people go into purgatory, limbo. Where does this come from? As in, who determined that this is what happens, and how do they know? How long do they stay there? Well then, I kind of already got at some of that. Purgatory and limbo are different. So limbo is a place that I talked about, that sort of gray place in between heaven and hell where infants go, and that's out. Purgatory, though, is still a very real thing. But it does not have a lot of biblical evidence. So the Catholic Bible is a little bit different from the Protestant Bible. It's got some extra stuff in there, including the Book of Maccabees. And it says in the Book of Maccabees, it is a good and wholesome thought to pray for the dead. That's a bit of a head-scratcher, right? If when you die, you go straight to heaven, you don't need prayer, right? I mean, it's about as good as it's going to get for you, right? I mean, what do you say? God, pour him another one? But if you go to hell, prayer doesn't really do you any good either, right? So that passage, that image, is sometimes used to say there must be something incomplete for a little while. Some way that our prayer helps them? Huh? What would that look like? How would you be in such a place after you died that you don't have the fullness of heaven or the complete absence that is hell? Maybe you're still kind of on a journey. Maybe you're undergoing some kind of transformation. You need to let something go, or, I think of sometimes like some of our ghost stories, there's this spirit that's haunting this house. It can't let go for some reason. And purgatory is often about worldly attachments. You think of an addict that has to quit cold turkey. All of your attachments are gone now, and it's going to be a shock. It's going to be an adjustment. So that is one way of talking about purgatory. That's, by the way, I grew up with talking about purgatory. People have portrayed it artistically with a lot of imagination. It's, again, not in the Bible. We're just fancifully filling it in from a couple of verses, okay? So Dante, that great classic of Italian literature, I recommend at least trying to read the Divine Comedy. I got halfway through the second of 3 books. So it's a journey that takes Dante down through hell, as Dante may imagine it. Spoiler alert, a lot of Dante's political enemies are in hell. And then out the other side and up this mountain that is purgatory and ultimately into heaven. And he meets his wife along the way. So the images that he uses of purgatory and of hell and of heaven are meant to help people that are on earth. To say, I don't want to sin. I don't want to be a bad person. I want to be a good person. I don't want to suffer. I want to be happy. So he's portraying these images of just absolute misery and squalor in hell and glory and majesty in heaven. But purgatory for Dante is a place that he imagines of toil and difficulty, but also of joy. I wish I could portray just the magnificent joy of the souls that are on their way just to begin purgatory in Dante. A lot of people only focus about the negative. We tend, in general in life, I think, to focus on the negative too much. It has a way of grabbing our attention. And they look at purgatory and they say, oh, that looks painful. But see, for us here in life, we always have this kind of uncertainty. Am I going to heaven or not? And if you're in purgatory, you know you are going to heaven. You can't fail purgatory, okay? It's not a pass-fail class. It's not a grading on a curve class. It's a class everyone passes eventually. Your soul's been judged. You are going to heaven. Purgatory is just this place where you benefit from prayer, and you will make it there. So there's this overwhelming relief of the souls in Dante's image. They're just glad to be going there, and they're glad to be going through this stuff. It's almost like a training montage. You're like, oh, this is awful. Like, I'm lifting this rock or whatever I'm doing, But if that's what I got to do to get in heaven, heck yeah, I'm going to heaven, Like, there's just this excitement. Whereas hell is just, there's no future. They're weighed down by their sins, and they have no hope of escaping them. It's a miserable, miserable, miserable place. And sometimes people blur the images of heaven and hell a little bit. So purgatory. So I've kind of given 2 images of purgatory now, kind of the way I grew up thinking about purgatory and the way Dante thinks about purgatory, which inspires a lot of our paintings and a lot of our popular imagery. But there's another more modern way of thinking about purgatory from, I believe, a document called Space Salvi, which I don't have open in a tab right now, but oh my goodness, is it amazing. Actually, you know what? For you, I find it. So, Space Salvi, oh, look at this, come on, Vatican. So you can do a white background sometimes. So, I should actually let you see what I'm seeing. Okay, so, Pope Benedict wrote this document about hope. And he says at the end of it, some recent theologians, I was talking to one of my teachers. Apparently some recent theologians mean Karl Rahner. He doesn't call him out by name here, but it was pretty clear to the experts who he was talking about. And this teaching is sort of in a weird place because the Pope is putting us in a very official document, which is a pretty high endorsement, right? I mean, that's about as high as it can get. But he's not really footnoting it so he could blame somebody else. So he's taking a lot of weight for this, a lot of credit for this. But he's also, got this kind of, hedge a little bit. He's not saying, I would endorse or I would say. He's saying, some recent theologians would say. But I find this way of talking about it, Karl Rahner's way of talking about it, to be very, 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 very helpful. And I've had this conversation actually with Pastor Aaron Neff, who was until recently over at Corfu Presbyterian. And he found it to be actually a helpful image as well, in terms of not necessarily that he's going to be all excited about purgatory as a Protestant, but it made much more sense to him that Catholics would believe this. So some recent theologians are of the opinion that the fire which both burns and saves is Christ himself, the judge and savior. The encounter with him is the decisive act of judgment. Before his gaze, all falsehood melts away. So it's the pain, such as it is almost an emotional pain. It's not like some angel standing there with a blowtorch going, suffer, suffer. It's a pain of regret, of looking back and knowing that we hurt people. We rejected love. We turned away from God and hurt him as well. And you finally meet him and it all becomes clear and you're like, what did I do? Have you ever, you've had that experience, right? That awful experience of regret. I think of when I was learning to drive a car, and I was in the family minivan, and I was driving, and we were pulling out of a mall, a little strip mall. We just stopped for like ice cream or pizza or something like that. We were on our way to the zoo. My mom was in the shotgun, and my siblings were in the back. I looked to the left, I looked to the right, and I looked to the left again as I was pulling out, and a GMC Jimmy was barreling down the road, going a little faster than he should have been, and I pulled out in front of him. And new as I was, I panicked. I hit the brakes. He probably could have pulled around me. I gunned it to try to get into the other lane. I realized I couldn't. I hit the brakes again, and now I was completely blocking his lane. He probably could have broadsided me right there. He swerved to try to get around me, lost control of his vehicle. Jimmys are a little top-heavy, and flipped into a ditch. And while most of the body of the car, the car was hidden by the walls of the ditch, I was under the impression that it had pancaked completely. And in that awful moment, I thought, I killed someone. And all I could do was pray over and over again, Jesus, 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 Jesus. And I pulled over and we tried to figure out if he was okay. Paramedics were on the scene very quickly, and it turned out that they were fine. The vehicle protected their life. And so I think purgatory, it's probably best to think of it as a moment that's kind of like that. All of our little self-deceptions fall away, and we think, oh my God, what did I do? It's pain of regret. But in that same moment, he says, in the pain of this encounter, when the impurity and sickness of our lives become evident to us, there lies salvation. You have to go through it. You have to see things as they are, because that's how God sees things. His gaze, the touch of his heart, heals us through an undeniably painful transformation as through fire, but it is a blessed pain in which the holy power of his love sears through us like a flame, enabling us to become totally ourselves and thus totally of God. In this way, the interrelation between justice and grace also becomes clear. The way we live our lives is not immaterial, but our defilement does not stain us forever if we have at least continued to reach out towards Christ. And it's burned away by Christ's passion. And it talks about duration here as well. In the past, we would sometimes try to measure duration. You'll sometimes find an old prayer book that says, say this prayer and you get like 28 days off of purgatory. And that was, again, a bit of speculation on our part. We knew that death is tied to the material world and the purgatory is immaterial, but we also knew that it had to be a moment that passed because heaven itself doesn't really have a sense of time. So if heaven is outside of time and purgatory is outside of time, how can you have an after for purgatory? You need like a before and an after. So we'd say maybe it's like a time like angels have. I don't know. Benedict kind of gets around this by saying it's a moment. You die, it's a moment. It's an experience that you have of regret, but then you are healed, and as you're transformed, you're ready for heaven. You can't calculate the duration of this transforming burning in terms of the chronological measurements of this world. So here again, talking about the material world and the laws of physics. And it's the heart's time, it's God's time. And then he says, he talks about prayer. The East does not recognize the purifying and expiatory suffering of souls in the afterlife, but it does acknowledge, this is one of the quirky little things that the East and the West go back and forth about. If I remember correctly, they don't have purgatory, but you can like be saved from the outer circle of hell or something like that. Just, we love to dance around these little things. But the souls of the departed can, however, receive solace and refreshment through the Eucharist, prayer, and almsgiving. Aha, okay, so you're benefiting them through what you do. You're praying, you're giving to the poor, and you're receiving Eucharist on their behalf. So how does that work? How does that fit in? And it used to be seen as a very transactional thing. I'm giving $20 to the poor, and that gets my loved one a day out of purgatory. I don't know how many days they got left in their sentence, but I'm sure it helps. And Protestants get very upset by that if you talk to them, because that's a very weird way of thinking about God. But with this image, it's just like this person is just. It's the Tale of Two Cities, right? It's the best of times, it's the worst of times. You absolutely know that you're going to heaven and you're in front of God whom you've been longing for your entire life, and you also recognize that you're an absolutely miserable human being who messed up many, 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 many chances to do good in this life, and a lot of people got hurt because of it, right? So it's the best day of your life, it's the worst day of your life. Knowing that you have people with you that love you, in some sense, even if they're not standing there with you, but knowing that there are people that are making sacrifices on your behalf in the world, that because of you, because they care about you, they're down here and they're doing good, maybe some of the good that you should have been doing, maybe they're helping some of the people that you should have been helping. It's a consolation, right? You think like, oh my goodness, okay, it's not as bad as I thought. It's a comfort. So that's one way of thinking about the good that we do, is helping those who have died, comforts them in what would otherwise be a very, very depressing situation in some sense, but also a very hopeful and uplifting one. So how long do they stay there? It's not something we can measure with time. And if you're going to take that third interpretation that I was talking about, Karl Rahner and Pope Benedict, they would say it's a moment. But I don't think that our efforts are ever wasted. So the moment that they experience, maybe it's right at the moment of their death from their point of view, but if a day later you're giving alms for the poor, if a year later or 10 years later you're receiving Eucharist for them, it still helps. God is outside of time, he sees it coming a mile away, and maybe from their point of view, they're experiencing that as the present moment. It's hard to say what it's like outside of our universe. So, all right. Whoa, I'm still not back on that. I'm sorry. I need to get used to like switching back and forth between here. I'm like highlighting. I like to highlight things as I'm talking about it, and then you can't see that if I'm still on the other thing. So, last two questions that I have so far, and these came in kind of directly, so kind of tacked them on here to the end of the list. Why in some Gospels or Bible stories does God send destruction to certain places or people? A really good question. God is a God of love. God is a God who saves the innocent, who spares the innocent, right? Again and again and again, we see him doing that. So the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, probably one of the more famous ones. All kinds of awful things are going to happen to Sodom and Gomorrah because of the way, they treated strangers. People are coming to Sodom and Gomorrah from out of town, and they're being treated awfully. We can pull this up again real quick. Sorry. I should have had this open in a tab already when I was looking at it before. The basic quote, though, is, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Abraham will surely become a great powerful nation. I'll have chosen him, blah, 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 blah. Then the Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin so grievous that I'll go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know. And sin gets associated with homosexuality in tradition for various reasons, but the context suggests that that's merely an example of them forcing a particular kind of relationship on strangers, rape, basically. And that's an example of just how bad they are at entertaining visitors. And of course, they're about to be entertaining visitors who are angels. It's a good test of their hospitality. So, and they mess that up pretty badly. But remember that Abraham is going to be pleading with God here for God to spare the city for the sake of the innocent. When God sends a cataclysm, and that was one way to explain disasters back then, people were well aware that a lot of innocent people would get hurt as well. It's a very, very, very blunt tool. So it's like, oh, this city is so bad that maybe we could be justified by killing a few innocent people if we just take it off of the map, you know, and then they'll stop hurting other innocent people. It's an investment. But so we wind up in this strange situation where God is arguing with Abraham. And Abraham is pleading with God to show mercy. Now, you and I know that God is more merciful than Abraham, right? So, but this is the way that our prayer works sometimes, and we have these arguments with God sometimes. Say, God, this isn't fair. Why are you doing things this way? You should be, why is there so much suffering in the world? And then maybe you resolve, I'm going to go do something about it. Well, that's good. That's your prayer working. Okay. So Moses sometimes has these arguments with God, and God says, "Oh, let me go. I'm going to go I'm going to go smite them, and then Moses will start something new." And Moses says, "No, God, don't do that." So it's sometimes God is working with us, particular patriarchs in the Old Testament, and it can almost seem like a drama, like there's something dramatic here. God is letting somebody work out a really difficult issue in a space where they can have an argument, and by taking a certain side, God is almost forcing them to go the other way. So if Moses' mind is torn and he says, "Ugh, these people are disgusting, I want out," and God says, "You know what, you're right, get out of here, Moses, let's bail." Sure, let's go. And then Moses is like, "Well, wait a minute, God, no, I don't know if that's a good idea. Actually, they're not that bad. Maybe we should stay." And go, "Oh, really, Moses? Okay, yeah, we can stay. Okay." So it feels almost as though God is working through these things in a very humble way. For the divine to do something like that is really remarkable. So Abraham is going to go get Lot, and he's got every reason to be upset at the way Lot is, first of all, right? Abraham's chosen to be very merciful to Lot because he's family, but Lot has not treated Abraham very well. But Abraham's merciful. And Abraham has no reason to like Sodom and Gomorrah at all because of the way they've treated Lot. So Lot's treated Abraham badly, Sodom and Gomorrah has treated Lot badly, and so off they go. And the point of the story isn't so much this cataclysmic divine destruction that's smiting Sodom and Gomorrah. It's about how these kind of catastrophes interact with innocent people. The real threat in the story is what could happen to Lot, what could happen to Abraham. And it shows the destructive power of sin. These awful consequences that happen because these people sinned, and how looking back to such sin is dangerous. Once you go to God, you have to go with your whole heart, or things are going to blow up. Now, that kind of miraculous destruction doesn't happen very often. You never see Jesus do something like that. And it's almost as though it tapers out throughout the scriptures. The flood, fire from the sky, plagues in Egypt. And more you get, as things become clearer, you get a more nuanced understanding of how God is working in the world. So remember that when I was talking earlier about the different kinds of ways that we might see someone as baptized, Abraham has a covenant with God
But he's not going to see these other nations that are around him as having any kind of special relationship with God the way he does. There's a promise of a blessing to all nations eventually, but that hasn't happened yet. So it's sort of a weird situation, I think, that we find sometimes where God is acting in a certain way and doing certain things in the scriptures because that's the best that people can handle at the time. He makes very clear to Abraham that he will use his power to protect the innocent from the guilty in very radical ways. And that invites Abraham as well to fight very hard to protect the innocent and to be good himself because he doesn't want that kind of wrath being visited on him. But as time goes by, we gradually find ways to reject that more violent approach, ultimately culminating in Jesus choosing to die on the cross rather than pop out a sword or start, sending legions of angels to slay people. So it's a gradual evolution, and I don't think that it's God changing so much, because God doesn't change, although you seem to see his actions change. It's us changing, what we're able to accept, and how open the world is to receiving God's more loving care. So that would be one way to look at that. But I'll acknowledge those are some really tough passages in the Old Testament about suffering, because we know well that in some of those scenes, some of those wars especially, innocent people would have been hurt. Okay, this has nothing to do with theology, and I'm already at 46 minutes, but I just got one more question here thrown in the end, and I apologize. Carol, I think it is, that asked this one. It's a very particular regional question. Why do some parishes have many priests and deacons, but St. John's and Alden still does not have a pastor? We are in such desperate need of one. We pray, we write letters, but we do not even get an acknowledgement that a letter was received. Very sad indeed. It is, and I apologize. As your neighbor over here in Corfu, it saddens me. I think... Excuse me a moment. Talking a lot with these videos. When I was newly ordained a priest 10 years ago, I spent 3 years at Queen of Heaven in West Seneca, and I spent 3 years in the Southern Tier in Wellsville. They're both wonderful assignments. I had a good mentor I learned a lot from. But I think, while I wish every parish had a priest, being able to have more than one priest is like even more amazing. Because you get some variety, you can rotate through, and it was a load off my shoulders. Because if I get up there and I think like, wow, okay, I'm being me, maybe I'm being a little too casual, maybe this doesn't work for some people, but you know what, my boss will come along next week, and if they didn't like me, then maybe they like him. It's just, rather than having somebody stew every weekend in the parish because they don't like a pastor, they could just wait for the next week and get somebody else in. So I think it's, and it's just healthier because you get a nice variety of teachings. I mean, maybe somebody likes to bang out about grace and somebody else likes to talk about faith. Great. They complement each other. Very important. But back to St. John's, they don't have a priest. So I'll talk just kind of go into behind the scenes details kind of stuff, but just in general when it comes to the process of becoming a pastor. So when there's an opening in a parish, a priest is moving or retiring, it's posted up at the diocese. And information goes out at that time about the parish. And there's some questions eventually that get asked. There's a sort of a committee that comes together in the parish and a board up at the diocese that sends a representative to gather information from the committee. And all of this goes together to put up a packet about the parish and with information about it. And then it's posted for priests to apply to. So when I was in Wellsville, and I was coming to the end of my second 3-year term, it got to be time where for me to be a pastor by tradition these last few years in Buffalo. And so I was like, well, okay,
You could certainly wait for the bishop to ask you to take a place, but it's usually better to be proactive and to look for assignments as they come up and apply. So I was looking for a smaller place that was relatively uncomplicated for my first assignment as a pastor, because I wasn't going to have a mentor in that same sense. And so I had been working with a lot of schools up to this point. Wellsville has a Catholic school, West Seneca has a Catholic school, and I'd learned a lot, but for my first assignment, I just wasn't really ready to take on a school. I felt that would be a lot. So applied to, I think it's fine to say this, I applied to Sacred Heart in Bowmansville, and I was told that they were not taking applications after all. They changed their mind, and they didn't think that the place could support a pastor, and I said okay, and then they immediately sent a priest there anyway. So I was a little irritated by that. I said, okay, fine, I'll apply somewhere else. I applied to St. Teresa's in Akron, which was, actually I may have applied to Teresa's first. And Father Dave Baker was coming out of the interview as I was going in for the interview, because we actually got off the interview stage of priests applying, and I thought, oh shoot. I mean, I went through the interview, I took it very seriously, you never know. Dave is awesome, we were in seminary together, we have a lot of common interests. We both like board games. But I knew that he was really overdue for a place, for an assignment. He was well over his time, and it was a perfect fit. It was a really good starter place as well. So I thought, oh shoot, so he's going to get that for sure, and he did. And then this place opened up, and Father Dave and myself and Father Jim Fugel we were all in seminary together, and I had visited this parish a couple of times in Corfu or East Pembroke with Father Dave and Father Jim. We did board games together, so I had some sense of what it was like, and I'd been to Mass here before, and it reminded me a lot of Holly and Kendall, where I grew up, which was again 2 parishes joined together under one priest. And I thought, oh, this is perfect, and so I applied here, and I've been here about 4 years now. It'll be 4 years in June, I guess. So it's all of that to say that priests are generally, you're obedient to the bishop, but the bishop doesn't want grumpy priests, so he doesn't generally force you to go to a place that you don't want to go. He generally will wait to see if people apply. Now, Holly, where I grew up, my understanding is for quite a while, nobody wanted to go to Holly. Nobody was applying. So the bishop started to go into people and saying, rather than forcing them, you get a call from the bishop, and the bishop would say, have you looked at Holly? Boy, that might be a nice fit for you. You should really check out Holly. I know I've never had one of those calls, all right? That's my understanding, is kind of the way it goes. So you're getting a little pressure, right? He's starting to push a little bit. I'm in a bind here. These people need help. Would you please apply? And it happened, I understand from what I heard in rumor mill, he did that to several priests, and none of them would go to Holly. If you can imagine that. Nobody wanted to go. It was too far out. Which I grew up in Holly. It's a lovely place. Not too far out at all. But eventually, Father Mark Noonan agreed to go and was there for I think 8 years and loved it. The timing was right for him to go, and they loved him and he loved them, and it was a very, very, very good thing. So sometimes you just gotta wait for the right fit. So without going into any details, I've kind of been kind of on the outside of this process, just talking in general terms about how it works and then giving examples of other places. St. John's has been posted, is my understanding, for quite some time, which would suggest that nobody has applied. And if people have been asked to go, they have said no for one reason or another. So at this point, the final straw for the bishop might be that he would order someone to go under obedience even though they didn't want to. I don't know if that's the kind of pastor you would want, frankly. Somebody that's miserable and there begrudgingly, if that's going to bring some kind of healing ministry, it would be a miracle. And so we're sort of left in between. Now, there's a couple of things we can do about this in general. We're in the middle of a program called the Road to Renewal. And the Road to Renewal is inviting parishes to come together as what's called a family of families. And this has been paused when Bishop Scharfenberger left to make room for our permanent bishop, Bishop Michael Fisher. And Bishop Michael Fisher has been spending a little bit of time getting up to speed, but he will be revisiting all of this, and we'll be looking at ways that parishes can work together and share resources and hopefully share priests, because we have fewer and fewer priests. As you know, we have such a vocation shortage. We have a vacation shortage too. We have a vacation shortage because we have a vocation shortage, but that is not at all the most pressing issue of all of this. So it is my sincere hope that we will find some way to work together in this area with each other and share resources. I also want to thank Deb Brown for doing yeoman's work over there in that parish. That is not an easy thing to do. As Catholics, we're very comfortable with priests leading, and because priests are always men, in particular, we're comfortable with men leading. And we're missing out on some very talented people who have a lot of incredible skills to offer. So I've had the opportunity to work with Deb on a couple of occasions now as I've gone over for St. John's. I got a tour over there of the rectory and the school, and got to meet a bunch of people over there, and I've certainly been there for funerals as well. I know Deacon Mark Liederstorff pretty well. The Liederstorffs were friends of my parents when I was in homeschooling, so I got to know Kristen and Amanda as well. And although it's been years since we've seen each other, so I look forward to continuing to help out with St. John's as best I can myself, and I hope that somehow in this road to renewal, the diocese will find some way to get more priests over there helping. But I think it's also good to keep in mind that we're going to need to see more lay leadership stepping up to take on more responsibilities in the church. Maybe that's going to be administration and running the office, whatever that's going to be. And priests are probably going to be traveling around more and helping out in more places. But we'll see. I don't want to go into too much information here in case Bishop takes us in some very different direction that we're not expecting. But I agree with you that the situation over in Alden is very sad, and I long for a time that you can find the healing and help that you're looking for. And again, thank you very much to Deb for all the work you've done over there. We'll have to grab something over here at Buttercrumbs again sometime soon. So take care, everyone, for very patiently listening to what has become a very long video. I really thought this was going to be kind of a cleanup, and it's become almost an hour long. I'm sorry, that is way, way over length for YouTube. But that wraps up all the questions that I have received so far. Thank you very much for sitting here with me and Ducky Barnes here, and I will see you at the altar. Take care. God bless. Bye.